Thank you very much, Jay, for that very kind introduction. This is the fourth trade book that I've written and engaged in an author publicity tour for, and in each case, the high point of speaking about the book is coming back to MIT and discussing it with my colleagues, friends, and students. So thank you very much, the MIT Press Bookstore, for arranging this event, and thanks to all of you for coming. People often ask me what it's like to be on a book tour, and I think it's best captured in the following cartoon. Yes, a lot of people ask me that. The restroom is down the hall on the right. The Blank Slate is a book about human nature, and a starting point for this topic is realizing that everyone needs a theory of human nature. Everyone has to anticipate how other people will behave in their surroundings, and that means all of us need theories, explicit or implicit, about what makes people tick. So much depends on our theory of human nature. In our personal lives, we use it to win friends and influence people, to bring up our children, to control our own behavior. Its assumptions about learning guide our policies in education. Its assumptions about motivation guide our policies in law. And because a theory of human nature delineates what we can achieve easily, what we can achieve only with pain and suffering, and what we cannot achieve at all, it affects our values, what we think we can reasonably strive for as individuals and as a society. Because of this tie to values, it comes as no surprise that for thousands of years, the dominant theory of human nature in our intellectual tradition was intimately tied to religion. And in fact, the Judeo-Christian intellectual tradition encompassed a theory of human nature which made commitments about what we would today consider to be the subject matter of psychology. It was a modular theory. That is, it assumed that people come equipped with a capacity for love, a moral sense that presents us with standards of right and wrong, and a decision or choice faculty, a free will, that allows us to choose behavior in conformity to these standards. And although our free will is not part of the world of cause and effect, it is truly free, it has an innate tendency to choose sin. The Judeo-Christian theory has a theory of perception and cognition embedded in it, that our faculties keep us in touch with the world because God is no deceiver and he designed them to keep us in touch with reality. And it even has a theory of mental health, that mental health comes from accepting God's purpose, loving God, and loving our fellow human beings for the sake of God. Now, the Judeo-Christian theory emerged out of an interpretation of particular events narrated in the Bible. For example, the doctrine of free will comes from the story in which Adam and Eve were punished for eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge, which implies that they could have chosen otherwise, therefore free will must exist. Now today, no scientifically literate person can believe that the events narrated in the book of Genesis actually took place. And that opened up a gap for a new theory of human nature with the decline of biblical literalism. And a principal argument of the Blank Slate is that this secular theory of human nature is based on three doctrines, each of them associated with a dead white European male. The first one is the theory of the blank slate, or the Tabla Rasa, commonly associated with this man, the English philosopher John Locke. Now, all of Locke's works are now available on the internet, and a search reveals that he actually never used the expression, the blank slate, or the tabula rasa, but he did say something similar. Here's what Locke wrote. Let us suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence comes it by that vast store which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it with an almost endless variety? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word, from experience. Now, in Locke's time, and in ours, the blank slate had a great deal of emotional appeal. It implied that dogmas, such as the divine right of kings, could not be treated as self-evident truths, but had to be justified by experiences that people shared and therefore could debate. It undermined a hereditary royalty and aristocracy who could claim no inherent wisdom or virtue if their minds started out as blank as everyone else's. And by the same token, it undermined the institution of slavery because slaves could no longer be considered to be innately inferior or subservient. And this set of ideas is captured by a lovely cartoon that I clipped out of the New Yorker about 8 years ago, where one king says to the other, "I don't know anything about the bell curve, but I say heredity is everything." Now, we continue to see an influence of the blank slate in modern intellectual life. In most of the 20th century, psychology tried to explain all human behavior through a few simple mechanisms of association and conditioning. In the social sciences, culture and socialization has often been used as the only explanatory construct for human experience. And I'll give you one example of this from a well-known anthropologist. With the exception of the instinctoid reactions in infants to sudden withdrawals of support and to sudden loud noises, the human being is entirely instinctless. Man is man because he has no instincts, because everything he is and has become he has learned, acquired from his culture, from the man-made part of the environment, from other human beings. And that is a quote from the anthropologist and public intellectual Ashley Montagu. But the influence goes beyond scholars in universities and is spread to the culture at large. Here's another statement of the blank slate from a public intellectual. "I think of a child's mind as a blank book. During the first years of his life, much will be written on the pages. The quality of that writing will affect his life profoundly." And that is a quote from Walt Disney. And I'll give you one more. "When kids go to school at the age of 6, there's an empty bucket there, and someone, by the time they're 18, will fill that bucket. Is it going to be a parent? Is it going to be a good educator? Or is it going to be some other scum out there who's going to fill that bucket?" Now, there's another doctrine that often accompanies the blank slate, and the name that I'll use for it comes from a poem by John Dryden called The Conquest of Grenada, in which he wrote, "I am as free as nature first made man, ere the base laws of servitude began, when wild in woods the noble savage ran." Now, the noble savage is more commonly associated with this gentleman, the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And here's what Rousseau wrote. "So many authors have hastily concluded that man is naturally cruel and requires a regular system of police to be reclaimed, whereas nothing can be more gentle than him in his primitive state. The more we reflect on this state, the more convinced we shall be that it was the best for man, and that nothing could have drawn him out of it but some fatal accident which should never have happened. The example of the savages seems to confirm that mankind was formed ever to remain in this condition, that it is the real youth of the world, and that all ulterior improvements have been so many steps in appearance towards the perfection of individuals, but in fact towards the decrepitness of the species." Now, you can never understand someone, especially in a different century, unless you know who he was arguing against. And in the case of Rousseau, his foil was this gentleman who wrote, "Hereby it is manifest that during the time, and in the case of power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war is of every man against every man. In such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, no commodious building, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." This, of course, is the famous quotation from Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. Now, the doctrine of the noble savage also had a great deal of emotional appeal. It implied that there was no need for a domineering Leviathan, a government and police force, to keep us from each other's throats. If we're basically nasty, then conflict is a permanent part of the human condition, and we have to get used to it. If, on the other hand, we're basically noble, then we can work for a utopian society of the future. Children are born savages, that is, uncivilized. So if the inner savage in us is nasty, it means that child-rearing is an arena of discipline and conflict. Whereas if the inner savage in us is noble, it means that child rearing consists of providing children with opportunities to develop their potential. We continue to see an influence of the doctrine of the noble savage in modern intellectual life. We see it in the respect for everything green and organic and a distrust of anything man-made, as in natural childbirth, natural medicines, natural foods. We see it in the unfashionability of authoritarian styles of child rearing. And we see it in an understanding of our social problems as repairable defects in our institutions, in contrast to a traditional view in which they would be seen as part of the inherent tragedy of the human condition. And there's a third doctrine that accompanies the blank slate and the noble savage, commonly associated with this man, the philosopher René Descartes. Descartes wrote, "When I consider my mind, I cannot distinguish any parts, but apprehend it to be clearly one and entire. The faculties of willing, feeling, conceiving, etc., cannot be said to be its parts, for it is one and the same mind which employs itself in willing and in feeling and in understanding. But it is quite otherwise with corporeal objects, for there is not one of them imaginable by me which my mind cannot easily divide into parts. This is sufficient to teach me that the mind or soul of man is entirely different from the body," a doctrine which 3 centuries later would be derided as the doctrine of the ghost in the machine. And the man who coined that was Gilbert Ryle. It was not coined by the Police, even though they used it as the title of one of their albums. The ghost in the machine has a great deal of emotional appeal. We don't like to think of ourselves as just glorified hunks of machinery. Machines are insensate, built to be used, and disposable. Humans are sentient, possessing of dignity and rights, and precious. Machines have some workaday purpose, like grinding corn or sharpening pencils. Humans, we like to think, have a higher purpose, such as love, worship, and the pursuit of knowledge and beauty. Machines follow the ineluctable laws of physics, whereas behavior is freely chosen. With choice comes optimism about possibilities for the future, and with choice also comes responsibility and the power to hold people accountable for their actions. Finally, if the mind, as Descartes suggested, is entirely separate from the body, that holds out the hope that the mind can survive the death of the body, an idea whose appeal, I think, is all too obvious. Like the other two doctrines, we continue to feel the impact of the ghost in the machine. We see it in the fact that freedom, dignity, and responsibility are often seen as incompatible with a biological view of the mind, which is often denounced as reductionist or determinist. Now, no one really knows what these words mean, but everyone knows that they refer to something bad. We see it in the stem cell debate, where some of the theologians advising George W. Bush on stem cell research claim that it should be outlawed because harvesting stem cells from 5-day-old blastocysts occurs after the moment of ensoulment, and therefore is tantamount to murder, which means that perhaps the most promising medical technology of the 21st century is being debated in terms of when the ghost first enters the machine. And we see it in everyday thinking and speech, as when we talk about John's brain, which seems to presuppose some other entity, John, that's separate from the brain that it owns. Or when we see journalists speculate about brain transplants, whereas, in fact, they really should call them body transplants, because as Dan Dennett once pointed out, this is the one transplant operation in which you really want to be the donor, not the recipient. Well, it should come as no surprise that I think that these doctrines are deeply flawed, beginning with the blank slate. And the fundamental problem with the doctrine is that blank slates don't do anything. The inscriptions would just sit there forever unless there was some innate capacity to interpret their meaning, to combine them with other inscriptions, and to use them to organize behavior in pursuit of goals. No one denies the central importance of learning, socialization, and culture in all aspects of human life. The only question is, how do they work? And when Locke said there is nothing in the intellect that was not first in the senses, I think the ultimate riposte came from Leibniz when he said, except for the intellect itself. And indeed, the modern sciences of mind, I think, have posed a number of threats to the blank slate for these reasons. My own field, cognitive science, has tried to spell out how many innate mechanisms you need to do the learning that human beings undeniably do. They would include some kind of concept of an object and of causation, a number sense that allows us to conceptualize numbers separate from the entities they enumerate, a set of spatial representations that the brain uses to keep track of where things are and allow us to navigate in the world, a theory of mind or intuitive psychology that allows us to infer the thoughts and feelings of other people, a language instinct that allows us to communicate our thoughts to others, and executive systems of the frontal lobes that integrate information from other parts of the brain and carry out reasoning and decision-making. Evolutionary psychology has undermined the blank slate by documenting human universals. Now, though it is undoubtedly true that there are very important differences among cultures, which anthropology has called to our attention, in addition, there is a bedrock of human universals, patterns of thought and feeling that can be found in all human beings. The anthropologist Donald Brown has recently tried to catalog universal traits as documented by ethnography, and he's found so far some 300 of them, everything from aesthetics, affection, ambivalence, and antonyms, all the way down to verbs, violence, visiting, vowel contrasts, weaning, weapons, attempts to control the weather, and the color white. Now, evolutionary psychology has undermined the blank slate in another way by showing that many human drives can't be understood as ways that people maximize their happiness and well-being, but rather can only be understood as adaptations to an ancestral environment, the one that we evolved in and are designed to pursue evolutionary goals. An obvious example is our taste for sugar and fat, which sends many people to an early grave from eating too much junk food, but which was clearly adaptive in an environment in which these nutrients were in short supply, and so one could never get too much of them. Very recently, we've invented technologies that can crank out mass quantities of the stuff. Our tastes have not caught up, and we therefore eat more of them than are good for us. Another example is the thirst for revenge, which has led to enormous suffering in the forms of vendettas and blood feuds and cycles of violence, but which was one's only defense in a world in which one couldn't dial 911 to get Leviathan to show up when one was threatened, but a willingness to retaliate with violence and a reputation for toughness was the only defense against becoming a permanent punching bag. And less obviously, I think it explains our paradoxical desire for attractive mates. Now, the humorist Fran Lebowitz, I think, once made an insightful observation about our psychology. She said, people who marry someone that they're attracted to are making a terrible mistake. You should really marry your best friend. You like your best friend more than you're apt to like anyone you happen to be physically attracted to. You wouldn't pick your best friend because they have a cute nose. But that's all you're doing when you're getting married. You're saying, I'm going to spend the rest of my life with you because of your lower lip. Now, this indeed is a paradox, but I think it's resolved by research from evolutionary psychology showing that the physical signs of attractiveness are cues to health, fitness, and fertility, and by wanting to have children with someone with those features, you're combining your genes with other genes that have the best chance of leading to offspring that will be healthy and fertile in their turn. Neuroscience has shown that there is a complex genetic patterning of the brain, another undermining of the blank slate. This is not an oil refinery, but a diagram of the visual system of the primate brain, comprising some 50 areas interconnected in specific ways. And recent research has started to show how this cabling is laid out by complex patterns of gene expression. It's present and pretty much functional in the newborn monkey. And recent research with knockout mice has shown that the parcellation into cortical areas and their connections does not depend on sensory input or neural activity. Now, it's not just the basic cabling of the brain that's under genetic control, but to some extent the fine structure of the distribution of gray matter. Now, I'm going to present now results from a recent study by Paul Thompson and his collaborators at UCLA, who used MRI to measure the amounts of gray matter in different parts of the brain in a large sample of individuals. And they looked at correlations between gray matter in corresponding parts of the brain in pairs of people, and plotted them in false color so that deep blue or purple corresponds to no correlation, and other colors correspond to a statistically significant correlation. When you pair people at random, by definition you get zero correlation, and so here the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere, and a top view of the brain are depicted in deep blue. This is what happens among people who share half their genes, namely fraternal twins. And as you can see, a majority of the brain has a distribution of gray matter that is significantly correlated across these fraternal twins. This is what happens in people who share all of their genes, namely identical twins, and as you can see, even more areas of the brain are correlated, some of them at very extremely high levels of statistical significance. Now, we have reason to believe that these genetically influenced features are not just meaningless bits of anatomy, like the shape of your outer ear, but have functional consequences, which I think are nicely summed up in the following Charles Addams cartoon, also from the New Yorker. Separated at birth, the Malafert twins meet accidentally. And you can see identical twins with identical contraptions in their lap who bump into each other in the waiting room of a patent attorney. Now, the cartoon is not that much of an exaggeration, because studies of identical twins who were separated at birth and tested in adulthood show that they have astonishing similarities. My favorite example being the pair of twins, one of whom was brought up as a Catholic in a Nazi family in Germany, the other was brought up in a Jewish family in Trinidad. When they were bumped into each other in the lab in their 40s, both were wearing identical navy blue shirts with epaulets. Both of them kept rubber bands around their wrists. Both of them liked to dip buttered toast in coffee. Both of them flushed the toilet before using it, as well as after. And both of them liked to sneeze in crowded elevators to watch people jump. Now, you might think that these have to be coincidences. But in fact, these similarities are never observed in fraternal twins who were separated at birth and tested in adulthood. And they've been verified with more systematic measures using psychological instruments such as tests of personality and intelligence, which leads to what's sometimes called the first law of behavioral genetics, which is that all behavioral traits are partially, though nowhere near completely, heritable. The noble savage has also come under threat from recent studies of the mind. Behavioral genetics has shown that among the heritable traits are having an antagonistic personality, a tendency to violent crime in certain circumstances, and psychopathy, or the lack of a conscience. Neuroscience has shown that there are brain mechanisms associated with aggression. And evolutionary psychology and anthropology have underscored the ubiquity of conflict in human societies. Now, here's a graph from the archaeologist Lawrence Keeley, which plots the percentage of male deaths due to warfare in a variety of societies. The red bars correspond to a number of pre-state societies, hunter-gatherer and hunter-horticultural societies in the Amazon rainforest and New Guinea highlands. And they range from about a 10% chance that a man will die at the hands of another man, as opposed to dying of natural causes, to almost a 60% chance that that's how a man will meet his end. The tiny little blue bar at the bottom of the graph plots the corresponding statistic for the United States and Europe in the 20th century, and it includes all of the casualties from 2 world wars. So, not to put too fine a point on it, but when it comes to life in a state of nature, Hobbes was right, Rousseau was wrong. Now, what about our culture? Has human nature changed in Western democracies where we enjoy this comparatively low rate of violent death? Well, not necessarily. here's a question which I would like you to just think of and keep the answer to yourself. Please do not answer out loud. Have you ever thought about killing someone you don't like? Please keep the answer to yourself. Now, we psychologists are a nosy bunch, and several psychologists have asked samples of people, have you ever fantasized about killing someone that you don't like? And the answer is that about a third of men and 15% of women frequently think about killing people they don't like. And about 3/4 of men and more than 60% of women at least occasionally fantasize about killing people they don't like. And I know what some of you are thinking, yeah, and the rest of them are lying. But it's the ghost in the machine, I think, that has been undergone the severest threat. Cognitive science has shown that intelligence, this seemingly miraculous process, which was formerly attributed uniquely to some spiritual mental stuff, can be explained in mechanistic terms by the idea that beliefs are a kind of information, that thinking is a form of information processing or computation, not computation like your Macintosh or PC does, but presumably some kind of parallel analog fuzzy computation, but computation nonetheless. And that emotions can be thought of as mechanisms of feedback and control, a little bit like the principle that allows your thermostat to keep the temperature at a constant range. Artificial intelligence has confirmed that intelligent behavior can be carried out by a mechanism, most famously in the defeat of the world chess champion Garry Kasparov by the computer known as Deep Blue. But it's been neuroscience that I think has most thoroughly exercised the ghost in the machine through what Francis Crick has called the astonishing hypothesis. The hypothesis that all of our thoughts and feelings and passions and joys and aches consist of physiological activity in the tissues of the brain. And though the hypothesis is astonishing, there is increasing reason to believe that it's true. We know that a surgeon can, by sending an electrical current through the cerebral cortex, can cause the person to have an experience that's indistinguishable from a lifelike experience. We know that chemistry can affect consciousness, as when people take drugs with psychological effects. When a surgeon severs the corpus callosum and disconnects the two cerebral hemispheres, the result can be two largely independent consciousnesses co-residing in one skull, as if the soul can be bisected with a knife. We know that damage to the brain can eliminate a part of the person's mental life and can leave a patient unable to appreciate music or to make a moral choice. So Descartes was wrong when he said that the mind is one and indivisible. We know that the brain has a staggering complexity, 100 billion neurons interconnected by 100 trillion connections, which is fully commensurate with the staggering complexity of human thought and behavior. Finally, we have every reason to believe that when the brain dies, the person goes out of existence. Despite extensive efforts by 19th century scientists, no one has succeeded in communicating with the dead. Now, this isn't a new idea, and I think the most eloquent exposition of it comes from a remarkable passage in the Brothers Karamazov, in which the imprisoned Dmitry Karamazov has been visited by a local medical researcher, and he's now recounting to his brother what he's just learned. And he says, imagine, inside, in the nerves, in the head, there are sort of little tails. I look at something with my eyes, and when they begin quivering, those little tails, an image appears. That is, an object or an action, damn it. That's why I see and then think, because of those tails, not because I've got a soul and that I am some sort of image and likeness. Rakuten explained it all to me yesterday, brother, and it simply bowled me over. It's magnificent, Alyosha, this science. A new man's arising. That I understand, and yet I am sorry to lose God. Now, many people are sorry to lose God when they hear of these results, or sorry to lose the values that are traditionally associated with religion and God. And there's been a widespread fear and loathing of a biological understanding of human nature, both from the left and from the right. From the academic left, for example, the Manifesto Against Sociobiology by Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Lewontin, and others was posted after the biologist E.O. Wilson wrote his book Sociobiology, which was one of the first attempts to publicize the application of evolutionary biology to human behavior. And here's what they wrote. The reason for the survival of these recurrent determinist theories is that they consistently tend to provide a genetic justification of the status quo and of existing privileges for certain groups according to class, race, or sex. These theories provided an important basis for the enactment of sterilization laws and also for the eugenics policies which led to the establishment of gas chambers in Nazi Germany. And as a result of these accusations, when Wilson would speak at college campuses for years later, he would be met with demonstrators, such as ones called to his lecture by the following poster: "Come and hear Edward O. Wilson, sociobiologist and the prophet of right-wing patriarchy," and at the bottom of the poster it says, "Bring noisemakers." But it's also been the religious and cultural right that has been offended by these claims. In the Weekly Standard, a popular conservative magazine of political opinion, which I'm willing to bet not a single person in this room reads, Andrew Ferguson wrote the following: "Biological theories of the mind are sure to give you the creeps, because whether a behavior is moral, whether it signifies virtue, is a judgment that the new science and materialism in general cannot make." He contrasted it with the Judeo-Christian view, according to which human beings are persons from the start, endowed with a soul, created by God, and infinitely precious. And this is the common understanding the new science means to undo. Now, this was an articulate statement of this sphere, and not all the statements have been that articulate. Here's one from Tom DeLay, the House Republican Majority Whip, who offered the following theory of the cause of the Columbine High School shootings of 4 years ago. He said that these outbursts are inevitable because our school systems teach children that they are nothing but glorified apes evolutionized out of some primordial soup of mud. And the House Judiciary Committee received the following testimony from a creationist think tank about the dangers of Darwinism. They cited the lyrics of a rock song: "You and me, baby, ain't nothing but mammals, so let's do it like they do it on the Discovery Channel." Well, these are serious accusations, and I think that they really should be addressed, and that's what I tried to do in the bulk of the Blank Slate. I think that the fears of human nature can be boiled down to four concerns: the fear of inequality, the fear of imperfectibility, the fear of determinism, and the fear of nihilism, which I'll discuss separately. I'm going to argue that all of them are based on non sequiturs. They come about because these ideas are so unfamiliar, not because the conclusions actually follow from the discoveries. And I'm going to go further and say that not only are there not the dangers that so many people have feared in a better understanding of human nature, but there are actually dangers in denying human nature that have been less appreciated. And because of this, we should look at human nature objectively without putting a moral thumb on either side of the scale. So let me start with the fear of inequality. It comes from a basic mathematical truth, which is that 0 equals 0. If we're blank slates, we must be equal. But if the mind has any innate organization, then different races, sexes, classes, or individuals could be biologically different, and that would condone discrimination and oppression. Well, I think as soon as you see the argument laid out this way, you can see that it really doesn't follow. That it confuses the notion of fairness with the notion of sameness, and they're not the same thing. When the Declaration of Independence declared, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," Thomas Jefferson was not saying, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are clones." Rather, our commitment to political equality is foremost a commitment to recognizing certain universal human interests that arise because humans have a universal nature and suffer and prosper because of the same conditions. As the Declaration continues, people are endowed with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Also, it's a commitment to prohibit discrimination against individuals based on the statistics of certain groups, such as race, ethnicity, sex, or class, that they belong to. And neither of these believes declaring a priori that all human groups, however, or individuals, are biologically indistinguishable. Also, there's a downside of denying human differences. And that is that if you believe that people are indistinguishable, but you observe that some of them end up better than others, there's a temptation to assume that they must be more greedy or avaricious. And indeed, many of the outbreaks of violence against ethnic minorities in the 20th century came from ethnic groups that had cultural practices and set out social conditions that allowed their more talented members to prosper. And because of these visible individuals, the groups as a whole were often subject to expulsion and persecution and pogroms. The most obvious example is the case of the Jews in Europe, but other examples include the Chinese in Malaysia and Indonesia, the Indians in East Africa and the South Pacific, and the Igbos in Nigeria. Now, the second fear is the fear of imperfectibility, the dashing of the age-old dream of the perfectibility of humankind. And it runs more or less as follows. If ignoble traits are innate, such as selfishness, violence, prejudice, and rape, that would make them unchangeable, so attempts at social reform and human improvement would be a waste of time. Why try to make the world a better place if people are rotten to the core and will just foul it up no matter what you do? That's the nature of the fear. Well, I think that too is a non sequitur, because ignoble motives do not automatically lead to ignoble behavior. The human mind is undoubtedly a complex system with many parts, and some of these parts can counteract others, such as a moral sense, a set of cognitive abilities that allows us to learn the lessons of history, and executive systems of the frontal lobes that can convert these moral goals and knowledge of history into tangible behavior. In fact, the social progress that we undoubtedly have enjoyed over the past few centuries and that can be continued didn't come from denying human nature or erasing it and starting out with something completely different, but rather by taking one part of human nature and expanding its range of application. The philosopher Peter Singer, in his book The Expanding Circle, argued that universally you see humans demonstrate a capacity for empathy, an ability to sympathize with other people. Unfortunately, the default setting for that sense of empathy is one's own clan or village or tribe. And people outside that circle have traditionally been treated as subhuman. But what we've seen over the past few centuries is an expansion of that circle so that it embraces not just the tribe, but other tribes, other races, prisoners, children, the handicapped, the mentally impaired, and most recently, in the case of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all of humanity. And so this progress, ongoing progress, doesn't have to consist of pretending that human nature doesn't exist, but rather taking one feature of human nature and adjusting a knob or slider that controls the size of the circle that embraces the entities whose interests we treat as equivalent to our own.